Hi, everybody. This video is going to sort of continue on our discussion from Monday about how to analyze arguments that are presented to us in a creative form. But instead of continuing with the Adventure Time episode, we're going to be shifting gears and talking about one of my favorite films in sort of the issue film genre, which is Adam McKay's The Big Short from 2015. To review some of the things that we talked about earlier in the week, the focus of this week is essentially narrative arguments. I say arguments in a creative work, but you'll also find this simply described as a narrative argument. And a narrative argument is just a story that tries to make a point about something. Okay, we're surrounded by media that tries to make some kind of intervention or some kind of commentary on one of the issues of the day or on some controversial problem. And we may have even had the experience of watching something that comments on one of those issues and maybe having our opinion shaped or having our mind changed, even. Um, and so the purpose of this unit is to give us some tools to be able to analyze and think about these kind of arguments more critically. Okay, so rather than just simply taking them as given. So one of the things about narrative arguments is that when we see an argument presented in a story, often the argument itself is kind of ambiguous. So two different people can watch the same film or read the same book and come to somewhat different points of view about what it is actually saying about a particular issue. So we saw this in our discussion of the Dungeon Train episode, that it is possible to see that episode as having a very negative point of view on video games, that video games ruin your life, essentially. Or you can see it as having a sort of more moderate and nuanced view. It depends kind of on what you think the most important elements of that episode are, whose perspective you find the most sympathetic, and what techniques you think the filmmaker is using in order to try to shape our perspective. That's perfectly fine. It's expected that there will be differing interpretations of a narrative argument, or just like there can be different interpretations of a work of literature. Okay. The thing about narrative arguments is not only are the claims not often explicitly stated, but there usually isn't explicit reasons and evidence offered for its claims. So it would be difficult to apply a Toolman model to most narrative arguments because it's not, citing scientific studies or doing any of the typical things that we would expect of a standard, straightforward argument. Um, and because of that, it's important for us to have some other tools in order to look at them. Okay, so again, so that we can begin to develop ways of seeing them more critically and maybe a little bit more objectively. Because the thing about narrative arguments is that they can be just extraordinarily persuasive and powerful. Like I said, I think we probably have all had the experience of being moved by some piece of media that we have seen that has some relevance for the present moment or that says something about contemporary politics or something like that. And there are many historical examples of pieces of media, of creative works that have shaped public opinion and moved politics. So, for example, in the 19th century in the United States, Harriet Beecher Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is about sort of the terrible conditions that enslaved people experienced in the American South. And this book was written in this very sentimental style. It was designed to have this very strong emotional pull, these very strong appeals to pathos. And indeed, it did actually help shape public opinion in the North. It helped bring a lot of people in the northern states to the side of abolition, to become more sympathetic towards the condition of enslaved people, and to begin to support the idea that slavery ought to be ended in the United States. It also influenced a lot of politicians. Abraham Lincoln would later tell Harriet Beecher Stowe, kind of jokingly, "Oh, you're the little woman who started this war," speaking about the Civil War. That's not entirely true. The Civil War wasn't started explicitly over Uncle Tom's Cabin, but it certainly did help radicalize Northern opinion. I say radicalize just in terms of how passionate people got about the cause, um, towards the cause of abolition. It helped mobilize people in the North to care about this issue. Okay, so in order to in order to understand how a narrative argument works, there are some things that we could look at. I mean, first of all, like we talked about on Monday, we can look at story and character elements. So we want to consider which characters we are asked to trust and why. Basically, how do the characters establish their ethos? Um, who are we supposed to sympathize with? Okay, whose perspective are we meant to take? Which can be, of course, an appeal to pathos, and what narrative consequences result from the choices that characters make. One important part of being able to look at fictional works critically is understanding that what happens in the story is not necessarily an inevitability. This is a set of choices that the writer or the filmmaker is making. In order to make a point, the filmmaker or the writer will usually attempt to show that the whatever happens at the end of the story is the result of choices that characters made much earlier in the story, good or bad. Okay, so it's not necessarily something that had to happen. It's not necessarily something that was inevitable. It's what the writer decided needed to happen. And in order to be able to analyze these things, we need to, again, start seeing this as a set of choices that it is being made on the part of the storyteller and not just something that has to exist. Okay, so moving away from Adventure Time, we are actually going to start talking about sort of more complex narrative arguments that exist in a cinematic genre. The cartoon story is fairly straightforward. It's a little bit more simple. But in most films, in addition to just the story and the characters, we also need to look at other things because unlike text-based media, um, visual media has a lot of other tools at its disposal to get us to feel things or to get us to kind of come over to the perspective that the filmmaker wants us to take. So, in addition to story and character, we need to look at things like how is the camera placed and how does it move, because that can often tell us whose perspective we're meant to sympathize with. We want to look at the editing of the story, and all editing really refers to is basically the sequence in which we see certain scenes and certain shots, how the whole thing is put together. We might ask, does it have a very linear setup where things follow one right after the other in chronological time, or is it a little more scattered? Is time distorted? Are scenes intercut so that we're looking at multiple things at once for us to digest multiple narrative elements at once. Likewise, sound design can do a big part of the storytelling. What is very loud in the scene and what is very soft? That's the most obvious way to kind of think about it. And what does it draw our attention to? How does it make us feel? Is the sound design very naturalistic, meaning it's supposed to highlight the realism of the scene? Or is it very strange? Like, does it include sounds that we wouldn't normally hear in the particular location that the scene is happening in, which might highlight our sense of unreality and kind of disturb us in some way? We can also look at lighting. Whether a character is placed in the light or in the darkness can tell us a lot about the frame of mind that they are in, about their moral status within the story. There's lots of things that lighting can do. And then, of course, there's music. And this is all very familiar to us. Scary sounding music makes us feel scared. Sad music makes us feel more sad. Music plays a big role in, one might say, manipulating our emotions as we are watching a story unfold in a film. Okay, so we are going to take a single scene from The Big Short, and I am going to explain how I think these different elements work in this scene to make a particular point. Okay, and I want to emphasize here that this is an argument that I am making. All right, this isn't the one definitive interpretation of this film. And I encourage you in the discussion that follows to dissent from my interpretation if you would like, to offer your own, or maybe to show how what I am talking about works in other parts of the film. Okay, so I'm offering this as an example, but I'm expecting you to be able to apply these concepts in scenes that you choose to analyze for our discussion thread. Okay, so the scene we're going to look at is the one that immediately follows this title card. So we have that little prologue, and then we see the camera zooming out on a typical American neighborhood. And then we get this scene with Christian Bale's character. So this is really the first main scene of the film after that prologue that kind of explains the origins of mortgage-backed securities to us. So I'm going to argue here that there are two main purposes of this scene. And the first purpose is to establish Michael Burry, Christian Bale's character, as this kind of genius outsider. And I will say that in the overall context of the film, this is a film that works hard to convince us that basically all its main characters are outsiders. Maybe not all geniuses like Michael Burry, but know something that nobody else knows. Okay, all of these guys are kind of strange. It makes the film a little bit funny and relatable. And all of them are strange in a particular way that enables them to see that there is something wrong with the financial system and that it is on the verge of crashing. Okay, so you can do this exercise with any of the scenes that help establish who these characters are and why we are meant to trust them and what it is that enables them to see the problems in the financial system that absolutely nobody else sees. I'm also going to say here that there's a reason why the film does this. And that is because the financial activity that these guys are engaged in was, in the context of 2008, pretty controversial. So short selling at the time was by some people blamed for the financial crisis, okay? Because what was happening is the bottom was falling out of the mortgage market and you had these guys who were making money off of that fact. A lot of these guys got really, really rich shorting the mortgage market. That's not a very sympathetic thing. When everybody else is losing their job and losing their savings, to see these guys make millions and even billions of dollars off of what had happened, it makes you kind of hate them a little bit. So there were lots of articles written in 2008, pretty much all in the popular press, blaming short sellers for the financial crisis and saying it was their activity that caused the whole thing to go bust. And if there hadn't been somebody doing that, then the system might have been salvageable. The whole thing might have been prevented. And so you saw headlines like, "Are short sellers to blame for the financial crisis?" There was even a ban on short sales of financial stocks at some point in September of that year. Um, it was, of course, later lifted. And afterwards, you start getting people arguing for for the cause of short sellers, explaining essentially the function that short sellers play, the role that they play in a healthy market and in a healthy economy. And one of the people who was making this argument was Michael Lewis. Okay, the whole purpose of The Big Short, in a way, is to basically show that short sellers were not to blame. That in fact, it was guys like this who sort of did the essential work of revealing the dishonesty of the whole system, revealing its hypocrisy, and revealing the delusion that essentially home mortgages or home prices would just continue going up and up and up, and that the amount of debt that was being incurred to support this whole thing was somehow not a problem. So the thesis essentially of Michael Lewis's books is that the short sellers are in fact kind of heroes. They're kind of modern day truth tellers. And we ought to, respect what they have done and maybe even consider listening to them when they try to call BS or try to reveal the dishonesty of other parts of the system. And that, of course, is a proposition that you can agree with or disagree with. It's a controversial point of view. But Lewis's book, like these other arguments about short selling, were pretty influential in shaping people's views of the financial crisis. Okay, so again, there's a reason why this film, and building upon what Michael Lewis did, there's a reason why this film wants us to see these guys as outsiders, because it wants us to see that these guys are different from the rest of Wall Street, different from the rest of the financial system. And they're different in specific ways that allow them to see what is wrong with it. Okay, so this scene here does several things to kind of show us that Michael Burry is not your typical money manager. Although, of course, it's not revealed that he is a money manager until the very end of the scene. Okay, from the very beginning, he just looks like kind of some strange guy in an office talking to somebody else. We don't know what the relationship is between the two characters or what their jobs are. So there are several things that are used in order to show us that Michael Burry is not a typical Wall Street guy. First of all, there's the way he is dressed. He is wearing a t-shirt and shorts. We later see that he is in his bare feet, not wearing shoes. This is not how somebody typically behaves in any kind of office, much less the office of a hedge fund, a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund. Okay, so his look is unusual. Then we have the props. Like he appears to be in some kind of meeting with a colleague in some kind of business setting, and here he is with these drumsticks, like pretending to play the drums. And he also has one headphone still in his ear, as if like he wasn't going to fully stop what he was doing in order to talk to this guy. So his manner is very casual. It seems on some level inappropriate for the office setting. He doesn't seem like a typical business guy. Then there's also the shot composition. Okay, the camera, as you can see, is placed behind the head of the guy who it later turns out is there for a job interview. We don't actually see that guy's face. We're looking at Michael Burry over his shoulder. And one of the things that does is it's showing us Michael Burry from this guy's perspective. Okay, it's getting us to kind of see Michael Burry through this other guy's eyes, which is as this really kind of strange person who seems to behaving a little bit inappropriately given the setting, a lot inappropriately once we understand that it's a job interview. Okay, so and we're going to talk about the role of this other person in the scene as an audience surrogate, but this is what I want to establish here is that we're seeing Michael Burry from somebody else's perspective here at the beginning. And then there's this very strange dialogue. Michael Burry, Christian Bale's acting is such that he speaks in a very kind of almost a whisper in this scene, so that we would expect it to be a little bit difficult for the other person to hear him. If you listen to the cadence of his voice, he emphasizes strange words and syllables in a way that he just does things that we wouldn't normally expect in the way people just typically speak in regular life. And then his face makes sometimes exaggerated movements, but he's giving this little speech about what happened in the lead up to the Great Depression and its relationship to what was going on in 2005. And it's all delivered in this somewhat kind of detached and somewhat strange way, to the point where he almost sounds like a conspiracy theorist. So after we have this establishing shot with Michael Burry right here, and we kind of see what he's all about, we have this shift. So what happens is that we go from that shot over the head of the other person in the scene, his future assistant, to the camera starts to zoom in. And when it zooms in, it begins to blur. And it gets really blurry like it does down here in this bottom right frame. And then the focus is restored, and we see Michael Burry's face clearly again. But what happens is that the film then goes into slow motion. So we see his mouth moving very slowly, and then the scene transitions. Okay? So there's multiple things going on here. There's this camera zoom that kind of signals to us that we are changing perspectives. We are going from looking over another character's shoulder at Christian Bale to looking directly at him. And usually, when a camera uses a close up technique like this, it means that we are sort of going inside the head of this particular character. And that is, in fact, what we are going to do. So we have the zoom in. Then we have the blur, which distorts our perspective and perhaps suggests that we're not seeing Michael Burry exactly clearly. That this person we see here who appears very strange on the surface, that's not all there is to him. We haven't really seen him 100% clearly. And what we're going to see next is offering us a fuller perspective of how he sees himself. And then we have the time distortion. And I'll say that this is a technique that this film uses a lot. Slow motion, weird editing cuts, lots of stuff that distorts our sense of time and space and reality. And that serves also to highlight the disorientation that the characters are feeling in a particular moment, and also to kind of impress upon us the madness of the whole situation that they are in. That there's a kind of almost delusional mad behavior that's happening in the financial system, and it's reflected in the kind of crazy frenetic way that that the film behaves, the way it distorts time, the way it distorts reality. Okay, so from this transition, we go to the flashback. And this again is another technique that the film uses is we flash back to earlier moments in time or we flash forward, but further distortion of the linear time structure such that we're never kind of really sure where we stand. We don't ever really follow one particular story for very long. There's always lots of going back and forth between different time periods or different realities. Um, in addition to that, during the flashback, we kind of get a number of other techniques. So, first of all, we have the editing and the sound design. So, we get to this scene where there are young people playing American football, and we see parents and cheerleaders cheering for the players on the side. And at first, it all looks very real. And then all of a sudden, the sound completely drops out. You know, right as this quarterback steps back to throw the ball, the sound drops out of the scene. And we get the introduction of the soundtrack music, the music that's kind of it sounds kind of poignant, a little bit wistful and sad, and certainly quite dramatic. That's meant to get us to start feeling something, and I think it's to get us feeling sympathetic for Michael Burry because again, the purpose of this flashback is to emphasize to us that he's an outsider, that he's somebody who feels like he doesn't quite fit in. Then the scene shifts to black and white, and we get an intercutting of color and black and white scenes along with this scene of Michael Burry swimming. And we get the introduction at that point of his voiceover, where he is telling us about himself and about how it kind of feels to be him in the world, about why he has so much difficulty relating to other people and making himself understood. So again, we have all of these techniques used. We have camera distortions, so the use of the blur effect, um, the use of the zoom in. We have this transition and these edit points where we have lots of shifting back and forth between the reality of the original scene, this flashback, and then this other scene in which Michael Burry is swimming. And then we have distortions of sound, and we have the use of black and white scenes along with color scenes. So I think what all of this adds up to is that it's meant to further emphasize the disorientation that Michael Burry himself feels in the world. All of these techniques help draw our attention to the artificiality of the film of the whole filming process, so that we kind of understand that we're not watching exactly real life, but rather we're watching something constructed. And it also serves to alienate us a little bit, to make us feel disoriented, to make us feel kind of caught off guard. You know, that what we've expected to happen has not happened. And this, I do think, mirrors Michael Burry's own experience of kind of moving through the world, that he never really knows where he stands. He never really sees how he fits. He never says the right thing. What he thinks is going to happen, how he thinks somebody might react, isn't how they react. And so our viewing experience is in some ways a stand-in for Michael Burry's own experience. And so we get like I said, we have the original scene that we were talking about, we have the flashback, and then we have Michael Burry swimming. And I think the reason we have the addition of Michael Burry swimming is because we have Michael Burry telling us about himself. And again, telling us about what it's like to be himself. And so we're seeing him in a moment where he feels like he is at his best. Because as he tells us, he most likes to be alone. That's when he feels most at peace with himself. Whereas in the earlier scene where we see him interviewing somebody else, that is obviously a situation in which he feels very uncomfortable, in which he feels disoriented and out of place. And so when he's telling us about himself, when he's talking to us about his own experience, we see him in a setting where he feels more comfortable. So perhaps where he is a little bit more emotionally open, although as we later see, he's actually kind of giving a weird confessional to the guy he's interviewing. Okay, so that's kind of my explanation for how this scene serves to show us that Michael Burry is this genius outsider, and why he's an outsider, and why we ought to sympathize with him and trust him. But there's another purpose to this scene. And the second purpose, I would argue here, is to introduce to us the origins of the crisis. Okay, so this scene, like a lot of scenes in this film, needs to do some work towards explaining what happened. And that's something I really want to draw a lot of attention to here. That this is a film that has a very difficult task, which is to try to make entertaining the details of a financial crisis that most people don't understand or didn't understand in 2015. Okay, and that means talking about a lot of really tedious and boring stuff, like mortgages and mortgage backed securities and credit default swaps, all stuff that most people, regular people who, go to the movies and watch films on Netflix and that kind of thing, don't know anything about. Okay, so this film needs to explain this stuff to us so that we will understand it. Okay, and as I'm sure you have noticed, the film uses several techniques in order to do this. So this is a scene in which Michael Burry is explaining kind of the history of financial crises and what some of the warning signs are that he is seeing in the current system in 2005. And he's explaining it to this guy who I am arguing here serves as a kind of audience surrogate. And this is again a technique that the film uses at various points. An audience surrogate is a character who sort of stands in for us. Okay, and in this case, the purpose of this character in this scene is needs to hear information that is really for us, the audience. Okay, so we see this character in this scene and we see him like one other time. He's not very important. We don't know anything about him other than that he eventually gets a job working with Michael Burry. He doesn't really have that much of a function, but in this scene, he is here to hear a bunch of information about the risks that are in the financial system at this moment, about the warning signs that Michael Burry is seeing. That's really it. He's just there to hear Michael Burry's speech. And the reason for having a character do that, rather than using some of the other techniques that the film uses, such as having the character just speak to camera, is for one thing, it keeps us in the story. It feels more like a real story if if one character is telling another character something else rather than just telling it to us. But also, I think it does something very important within this film because, like I said, these concepts are beyond the knowledge of most regular film goers. Most people don't know what a credit default swap is. And like Jared Bennett says later in the film, I'm going to skip to the next slide here. That's almost kind of by design, he argues. He says that all of these terms are kind of meant to make you feel confused or make you feel bored or stupid. He says Wall Street loves to use confusing terms to make you think that only they can do what they do, or even better, for you just to leave them alone. Okay, so one of the theses of the film maybe is that Wall Street uses all of this language in order to obfuscate what it's doing, in order to make you feel like they're really special people who deserve all the money that they make, and that you can't possibly understand what it is they're doing, so you'd better just not even try to examine it or look at it. So that's the argument that Jared Bennett makes. And I think that's part of why the film uses a technique like this one, because while we don't know a whole lot, we, the audience, don't know a whole lot about what Michael Burry is talking about, um, neither does this character. And yet, this character is a kind of financial insider. I mean, he's quite young, but he's the type of person who seems to credibly be able to get a job at a hedge fund, a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund. So he must know some stuff, and yet he's kind of mystified by what it is that Michael Burry is saying. So he allows us to be educated about this stuff without being made to feel stupid. He also, I think, kind of stands in for the financial system itself, and his incredulity, his disbelief at what Michael Burry is saying, also kind of stands in for the delusions or the disbelief of the financial system as a whole. So, there are several techniques that the film uses in order to explain this stuff to us. One is this audience surrogate method. Another is the breaking the fourth wall technique, which is when you have a character turn to camera and talk to us, the audience, and step out of the story. And then there is the celebrity cameos thing. So we have the one with Margot Robbie, with Anthony Bourdain, and with Richard Thaler, who's the one like actual scientist presented here, along with Selena Gomez. So I'm going to let you guys actually discuss those techniques in your own posts when you look at different scenes, because those aren't techniques that are used in this particular scene. But these are all techniques that are used in order to explain stuff to us. And I'm curious about your thoughts about why it's done that way and what effect it has on us as the audience. Okay. So the other thing that the film uses is a lot of irony and humor. It's pretty funny, you know, it has a lot of really great scenes. The Jenga scene is another one that I have used in in-person versions of this class, and I'm hoping that some of you will pick that one up and talk about it in your posts. But you know, it's only at the end of this scene that we see that Michael Burry works for a hedge fund. You know, that we see that he's, you know, sitting at a computer that has this kind of very corporate looking logo, and that we find out that the guy in the office is actually interviewing for a job with him. So it just serves to kind of further throw his strange behavior into relief, and serves to make him like even more of a weirdo, even more of an outsider than he already was to us. His behavior was already kind of inappropriate for an office setting, but it seems even stranger in light of the fact that he is actually a money manager, and it seems like a one with some authority and some control, given that he is in a position to give somebody else a job in this company. So that reversal just helps, again, upset our expectations a little bit, throw us off, and it's also meant, you know, of course, to be humorous. So we don't need to explain every single joke in this movie, because that kind of ruins the joke. But to just acknowledge that humor is used, again, for the purposes that I've already been talking about. Okay, so what you're going to do from here is go and find your own favorite scene from this film, and analyze it for us. So pick one or two techniques that you see in the scene, and talk about how it helps achieve some particular purpose that you see the scene as accomplishing. So there are lots of great ones you can use. You could use the other introductions to main characters, because there are, of course, several of them, and talk about how they are established as outsiders, geniuses or not. You could also talk about some of the scenes that are kind of the famous ones. So the Jenga scene is probably one. Also, the scenes, and there's several scenes in Las Vegas that are worth looking at. But keep in mind these different things: what the camera does, what sounds you're hearing, how music works, and again, talk about how that serves the particular purpose of that scene. So I look forward to reading your thoughts and discussing this some more with you. Uh, Good luck, and let me know if you have any questions.